Welcome, everyone, to the captive audience. It is the 29th of October. We are 7 days, uh, 1 hour and 58 minutes away from the election ballot deadline, whatever that means nowadays. And I am Kevin Hoare, or as I have tried to emphasize here with my change of name for tonight, turn out and turn this country around. And I am very pleased to be joined tonight by the eminent pollster and fantastic patriotic Republican Mike Riley of Riley Research. Thank you for joining us here tonight, Mike.
My pleasure, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
So, we've been bombarded with polls pretty much constantly. And as I watch the news headlines that are derived from polls, I have pretty much started to figure out that about maybe somewhere more than half of the polls are simply they allow themselves to be whatever their bias or their inaccuracy is in order for news headlines to be generated, which will be generated anyway, regardless of what the poll says, saying, so-and-so is in trouble, so-and-so is searching ahead. And we've seen this in the presidential race. And of course, people don't look a few layers down to see where the shifting eddies and currents are going within the electorate. But maybe we can start out. We'll just start out with the presidential race because that's the one everybody's sort of familiar with. And we've seen the weirdest election year that I don't think you could have even polled the things that have happened adequately in advance. Assassination attempts, second assassination attempts, a Democrat nominee for president withdrawing and being replaced by the vice presidential nominee, and then the wild gyrations that have happened since she became the Democrat nominee. And then we start to, but there at some point you can see trends. You can kind of see where things are movement, because a lot like real clear politics likes to average these polls. I don't know if averaging always necessarily produces the most accuracy, because if you average polls, but 60% of them just don't even seem to comport, so they tend to pull the average a certain direction. But in my view, like the last two presidential elections, Trump in particular has outperformed the polls or the polling averages, and certainly either won or had close races in places that they said that wasn't going to be close. So what's kind of your take at this point after seeing where things have led? Where have they come from in your view? And then what are the trends you see now happening in the presidential level of politics?
Well, I've heard there are two positions you can take. One is to be optimistic, and the other is to be hopeful. My position is that I'm optimistic, and it's for three reasons. Number one, Trump has outperformed in the polls compared to 2016 and 2020. He's outperformed what the polls had him at. Now, some say that Trump has been normalized to the extent that he may not have that shy supporter that was unreflected in the earlier polls. But I tend to still think that people tend to still under report their support for Trump.
Yeah, they call them, what do they call them? Hidden Trump voters in the polls is what I remember. There was a term for that. Yeah.
Or shy voters.
Yeah.
The other thing is that Trump is overperforming in terms of some key demographics, including Hispanics, including Blacks, including Jewish voters, including Catholic voters. There are a lot of areas in which Trump is overperforming relative to previous elections. So I think all that bodes well for President Trump. And finally, I think Kamala Harris has done a terrible job of distinguishing herself from President Biden in terms of what she would do differently. So I think even the most, except for the most ardent Kamala supporters, I think a lot of people are still having a lot of doubts about what a Kamala Harris presidency will look like. So I'm optimistic about Trump's chances in this election.
Well, some people described the post Kamala announcement, because I don't even know if the convention itself was the bump. It was just sort of the fact that it wasn't Biden anymore. Kind of gave her, they described it as a sugar high. And of course, sugar highs have to recede before you can see if they were in fact just sugar highs or there was something sustainable. It seems that whatever was going on in August definitely receded by sometime in September. And then you started seeing polls that had it either dead heat or even Trump up, especially in the 7 swing states that are being watched so closely. And now it seems like he's up in all of the swing state polls, at least the last time I checked. I know there's like from day to day, there's noise in these polls, right? But to be tied, statistically tied or up for someone who's outperformed the polls, and I actually agree with you. I think that there is still because he relies more heavily on lower propensity voters that may not be in that likely voter model for some of these polls to the extent that they should be. And then you start throwing in some minorities, which also at times have not only been lower propensity, certain groups within minority voters, but also maybe unprecedented in terms of their enthusiasm for a presidential candidate at all. This kind of looks like it's his election to lose at this point. The only place that I've seen him at times sort of falling behind, but then recovering is Wisconsin, and the Real Clear Politics average actually shows him up right now.
Well, I agree. I think the enthusiasm for Donald Trump is head and shoulders above the enthusiasm for Kamala Harris, which would benefit him in terms of low enthusiasm, low propensity voters. I think he's doing much better among low propensity voters this time around. So, frankly, I know it's not good to say, but I think it's over. I think Trump will win handily, and you don't want to ever quit before the finish line. You want to run through the tape. But personally, my view is that I think Trump's going to win handily.
Well, if I had to pick states that I think he does have, I would say he's got Georgia for sure. I think he's got Arizona. This stuff where they throw Texas and Ohio in there is just kind of silly.
Nevada.
Yeah. I think that if you have Georgia, Arizona, and what is the other one of those three? Georgia, Arizona.
Well, I think Nevada is an area where he is outperforming expectations as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. Nevada. And then you've got, and I think North Carolina is going to be his. I don't even think people are very happy with what's happened recently in North Carolina either. The Biden administration, I think that was actually a big screw up with the way they handled the hurricane. The 6 days it took for them to get any relief into many parts of the state, that cannot have helped a state that was a dead heat. So then, but the blue wall states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, it seems of those three, the one that Trump probably has a good path on is Pennsylvania. And if you win Pennsylvania, you kind of win the presidency. It's really hard for Kamala Harris, I think, to win the presidency if she can't win Pennsylvania.
Yeah, that's a critical one. It's very tight, really hard to call that one. But I mean, up overall and nationally as well. Nationally is kind of funny because I think he's getting a lot of support in places like New York and California, which he won't win. He won't win those states, but it does raise his numbers in the national polls, and it gives him a degree of momentum that he hasn't had in the past.
Yes, I think that is very true. And I don't know if he's going to win the popular vote, but I think he's actually looking a lot better than people would have ever imagined in the popular vote. there is definitely a degree of what he's been doing in New York lately might have something to do with this, but I also think it has to do with five congressional seats that they're
Right.
trying to win, and that is part of this game right now because there's a real problem that Republicans face. I think they haven't had as much money. Those House races tend to thrive more on money than they do on just like national media momentum because they're lower visibility, right? Unless there's a scandal or something. And the about a third of the races that they need, that Republicans need in order to keep the majority and or grow it, are in red states. And there are some in swing states. That's where I think they're focused right now because Trump's been doing well in swing states. So therefore, those seats have been a place they've started concentrating. But I think it's somewhere around 2/3 of the seats that Republicans need are in blue states, but they're seats that they've managed to win, like in 2022 and 2020. And that is where there's a big battle going on. And now you're starting to see Trump spend time in those states. They must know something, because I don't know if I would be spending any time in New York unless I could actually hit Pennsylvania by being at Madison Square Garden, you know.
Yeah, I don't know as much about the congressional, the House of Representatives, but it does seem like that Republicans are winning in the Senate seats, and
Yes.
that in itself is a big switch and a big opportunity for Republicans and for power nationally. So I'm happy to see that, but I don't know as much about the House seats.
The House, I think, is more complicated. The Senate, there are two seats. One seat they're going to win. It's going to go from Joe Manchin to I forget his name, but he's the governor of West Virginia, a former Democrat turned Republican, who's like a strong Trump supporter, actually. And so just him switching automatically put this at like a 50-50 nationally. And then there's John Tester in Montana.
Yeah.
And he is facing probably a very certain loss, I think a very likely loss to a Republican. And then there's a few other states where things could happen. There's Nevada. There's also Ohio, Sherrod Brown, who's facing a challenge from Bernie Moreno. Sherrod Brown, Ohio's a red state at this point. It's been won by Trump twice by 8%. It's got a Republican. It's got the other senators are Republican. It's Republican governor. Their state house and state senate are Republican. So it's kind of like that is the thing. And the only outliers are the Texas and the Florida races, where you got Rick Scott and you got Ted Cruz, where there's just it's a little closer comfort for some of the folks there watching those races. But having said that, just momentum wise, it's hard to imagine that just money alone in those Senate races are going to flip those seats.
Yeah, I find it hard to believe that Ted Cruz is going to lose. So I'm not particularly worried about that at this point. But it is kind of interesting for Republicans to imagine the possibility they might control all three seats, all three areas of power: the presidency, Senate, and the House of Representatives.
It's just, to me, ironic that of the three, the one that seems to be the most up in the air is the House, which we already have. But again, it comes down to each race, doesn't it? There's how good the candidates are, how much money they have, if there's an issue with an incumbent, et cetera. And then, of course, what state are they in, and how is that being affected by the overall stuff that's occurring? And I mentioned New York earlier, that there's 5 seats there, which I think those are upstate New York, I think, for the most part. And but they tend to swing.
But like you said, that's part of why Trump has been campaigning in New York, try to secure those House seats. I'm very hopeful for Lori Chavez DeReimers too. She's got a formidable candidate, but she won last time. I know they redistricted. They extended the district all the way down to Deschutes County, which makes it a particular challenge for her. But I'm still very hopeful for her.
Yeah, and that's one of the ones they've nationally considered a toss-up. We've got a couple of other seats that are in Oregon that are sort of in the picture. Not necessarily considered toss-ups, just like Lori's seat, but there's the 4th district where Val Hoyle is facing the challenge for Monique Despain, the retired Air Force colonel, and Val Hoyle's had her challenges because she's gotten involved with that same company, LaModa, that brought down the Secretary of State, Shemia Fagan, and has a federal investigation that's looking into her communications with LaModa and the illegal grant that she got issued to LaModa when she was the Boley commissioner. All this stuff wasn't known back in 2022 when her opponent was Alex Skarlatos. It came out after that, and so that's been happening. It's also a district. The 4th district is one that I think over 20 years has moved in a more conservative direction. When the coast used to be represented by Democrats in the state house and state senate, now it's largely Republicans.
Yeah, I don't think Hoyle has near the incumbency power that DeFazio had, and Monique Despain is very attractive candidate, both in terms of her background, her personality, and the district itself. So I'm really hopeful that we could possibly pick up that district. I'm not as hopeful about the district of Salinas. That's going to be a tougher one, I think, for Republicans, but I am very hopeful about Monique Despain. She's a terrific candidate, and I'm really hopeful that Chavez DeReimers also is able to eke it out.
Well, and this is quite a story that Oregon has these 3 seats that could actually be part of what it takes for Republicans to hold on to the House of Representatives. That's a great example of a blue state with 3 purple seats that are part of the extended battleground that the House of Representatives is pursuing, and the Speaker. There's a lot of going on in Oregon in addition to that. And by the way, one of the things with these races, it's possible that Lori's race has some polling that's been done. Maybe, there's large media operations like a television station and the Oregonian. They sometimes combine forces. They pay for polling, and you've seen this. You've been involved with this. But it's not done as frequently as the presidential races, where you can have like multiple polls, tracking polls, watching the ups and downs and the trends. It's usually just a snapshot, right? And then you have weeks go by and you don't know exactly what's happening. I know down in the 4th district, there really isn't any public polling, and even internal polling really is much less frequent because it costs money. We know that, right? I don't know about the 6th district. I think I heard recently that there was a poll that Mike Erickson was referring to and said that he was up. So I don't know, but we don't really. So how do people assess races when there isn't polling at that level?
Well, even when there is, a lot of times in this election, it seems like the polling has been very close. So, the margin of error, most of the information that I've seen from the presidential race on down has been kind of within the margin of error. And so you're hopeful that the people doing the polling have accounted for certain things like propensity, that sort of thing. I understand Will Lathrop is in contention. Last I heard, he was very close to being in contention for the attorney general position, and that would be a major coup. And just the notion that he's actually in contention for that in Oregon as a statewide race is encouraging. And so I'm very hopeful about a number of races in Oregon that you might not ordinarily think are viable.
Well, and that one, I mean, that not only are people frustrated with what's been happening with law enforcement and crime in the state, and of course there's the whole issue of drug trafficking. There's a lot of things that the attorney general's office really affects, but also he's particularly well qualified, and he's facing an opponent who doesn't really have any credentials, has no like criminal law experience.
He's operating a small private law practice out of Corvallis.
Right.
So he was active in the legislature, but he doesn't really have a lot of political experience and nothing on a statewide level. So, and Will, with his background, is incredibly talented. I see somebody had a question about margin of error. Margin of error refers to the sample sizes of the polls that are used. So if you have like 500 people in your poll, the margin of error is plus or minus 4.5%. If you have 1,000 people in your poll, the margin of error is plus or minus 3%, which means that if you were to redo the poll over and over again, you could expect the results to be the same to within plus or minus 3%. Like if you're up 2% in this poll and you do the same poll the people again, and there's a 2% deviation, that's all within the margin of error. And a lot of these races are within the margin of error, meaning that you can't really be certain who is up, who is down, based on sample sizes. And you can only achieve so much reduction in margin of error. You could poll 5,000 people, and it doesn't make that margin of error that much closer.
That much smaller.
And there are a lot of other variables too. Are they polling likely voters? Are they polling all voters? Are they just polling adults? The ideal is that you've got a sample that reflects the people who are actually going to turn out. In a presidential race, the turnout is usually much higher than in a typical race. So if you're not polling likely voters, it may not be a factor because more people are turning out. So it makes it difficult to judge, and you got to make sure your poll actually does reflect the people in the particular area that you're polling. But again, when things are this close, you can't be sure how close things really are based on maybe potential variations in the sample.
Yes, and there's the likely voter thing is a guess. It's an educated guess, right? But it's still like, here's what we think is going to happen based on the past, plus what we think this year's trends are. You ask when you ask the poll, do you expect to vote? And you just get an answer that sometimes is yes, no, or not sure, right? You can get those answers as part of your validation up front when you're taking the poll. But then there's what really happens. And then there's people trying to make sure you get the right proportions of people to match the overall electorate in that sample,
Right.
in such a way that you aren't missing somebody. Because notoriously, it seemed in the past, and I can't speak for the current polls, but there are national polls which are known for oversampling Democrats. I don't know that there's ones that oversample Republicans, but there are definitely ones that have had a history of being a bit more accurate relative to the outcome of, say, the presidential election. There was a crazy poll in Wisconsin just weeks before Election Day in I think it was in 2020 that said Donald Trump was down in Wisconsin by 17 points, which is insane.
You do have some tools you can use. In Oregon, you can look at the record of voters, and you can choose to survey only people who have a record of voting in like 3 out of the 4 past recent elections. Or you can look at the people who have voted in the past presidential elections. So that history is available to pollsters, and they can vote. They can look at only people who have a history of turning out. Not the case in Washington. In Washington, people don't indicate what party they're affiliated with, so you don't know that. But in places like Oregon, you can know what was the proportion of Republicans that turned out in this last election, what was the proportion of Democrats that turned out, and you can adjust your sample accordingly.
What I'm hearing, and this is just sort of numbers that float through the grapevine here, is that so far, and it doesn't indicate necessarily a trend, in the past, Republicans tended to hold their ballots vote late. So if you saw low Republican turnout early and high Democrat turnout early, then it was really just a comparison of how did that compare with, say, 2 and 4 years earlier at the same point in our 21-day election, right? But when you see deviances from that, so when you see Republicans turning out at a higher rate early and Democrats at the same time somewhat lower than the past, that starts to indicate maybe there's something to watch here, right? If it continues as a trend.
Yeah, it speaks to enthusiasm to agree, but I think also from President Trump on down have encouraged people to vote early. And there are a couple of benefits to that. One is that if you vote early, you stop getting phone calls, you stop getting mailers because they know your ballot's already in. So
Yeah.
you can take yourself off some of those lists. But the other advantage is that the parties then can focus on those laggards, those people who haven't voted, and try to make sure that they do turn out. But it also speaks to enthusiasm, and I think if people are voting early, that indicates a higher degree of enthusiasm than we've seen in the past.
Well, and I don't want to rain on anyone's parade here, but it's unlikely that the presidency will be determined by the state of Oregon and its electoral votes. It's interesting because people still feel a certain way and have an emotion about the election that they act on. 4 years ago, it seemed like Democrats actually were the ones that had the upper hand in terms of emotion, certainly in Oregon, right? Uh, this year seems to be flipped. Like people are really, really upset who are Trump supporters, even though, and so he might be in really causing people to turn out, not just period, but turn out earlier in the election, and in a way that will affect the down ballot races, or could affect the down ballot races as long as people don't skip those down ballot races on their ballot. And so it's hard to say if this is a trend that is occurring, but if that were to sustain itself, that could really affect the outcome, couldn't it?
Yeah, I think it is a trend. I think people are recognizing that there's less chance for any kind of problems to crop up if you vote early, less chance for you to like have a big storm that would keep you away from the polls, or show up at the polls and there's a big line and you go, all right, well, Oregon's not going to be a factor anyway. I might as well not vote. So I think people voting early is an important and admirable goal for the parties to try to encourage that.
Well, it seems like also a lot of Trump supporters in the state don't care if Oregon's not going to actually directly be impacted. They're just pissed off. But I do think it could affect Democrats who say, well, look, he's going to win Oregon. Eh, I don't know who these other people are. And I don't care. I mean, that if they don't feel engaged in any of the down ballot races, and I think we have seen that Kamala's enthusiasm issue is there. It's not as bad as Biden's, but it is not a lot better. I think she did some recent interviews, which surprised me. Not only that she was doing them, that she felt like she had to do an interview with CBS and she had to do an interview with Fox. She's doing an interview on Fox, where she did get asked some tough questions. And then she did an interview, I think, a town hall on CNN, and she kind of bombed all of them, which the people watching CNN and CBS are the choir. Those are a lot of the people that you would expect she would be getting. And maybe she had the effect of depressing her own turnout by just stinking it up badly in these interviews.
Well, yeah, she definitely underperforms in a live format where she's not scripted. There's no doubt. I don't think anybody sees her in a live unscripted format and says, "Wow, she really killed it, knocked it out of the park." I think where Kamala Harris's strength is with the women voters and the abortion issue. The fact that the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade a couple of years ago, and they're trying to make abortion a national issue, and they're trying to make voters believe that if they don't get out and vote for her, that abortion is going to go away. Not in a place like Oregon. It doesn't. I think most people realize that statewide in Oregon, the abortion issue is not on the ballot. But in other places where there's kind of more marginal support for abortion, like Texas, some of these kinds of places where I think women legitimately who are pro-abortion are concerned about the direction things are going. That's a big motivator for Kamala's supporters.
For supporters, yeah.
Yeah.
I think that on the flip side, the people who are really concerned about the economy and where it's been, the what's happened with public safety and that the border,
Yep.
and fentanyl, those voters really do seem to be motivated on the other side. And Kamala coming in doesn't seem to have affected those three issues very much, especially since when she talks about the future, she's actually in office now. So, and she's been in office. So when they're like, well, in the future, I'm going to do this because we need to do better now. And it really has hurt, hasn't it? Because I think you said at the beginning of the show here, she just did a terrible job distancing herself from Joe Biden. She wanted to have both. She wanted to be able to say we did a great job, but we're going to do all these other things in the future. And then she started really like showing pictures of herself in front of the Trump wall and saying it was secure and stuff that just I never imagined a year ago we'd even be seeing.
Yeah, it's definitely less important than the economy, less important than the border issues. Abortion is definitely like a third tier kind of an issue, but for some people,
voters,
that's highly motivating.
Yeah, for swing voters, quite possibly,
and women in general.
Yeah, and what is the group that she's outperforming with? Because if the polls are still close and Trump's doing better with, I think, black men in particular, Hispanics. And what was the other? Oh, and the Jewish community.
And
if he's doing better with those, where is he losing some? Because I remember hearing some Democrats saying, gee, I sure like our chances if Trump is relying on lower propensity working class voters to turn out. And all we have, and they think they can get more people that are like suburban, soft Republican or independents and get them to be dissatisfied or worried about Trump and then switch to Kamala. Where is Kamala outperforming?
Well, she's outperforming definitely in the suburban white women, highly educated women in the suburbs, definitely outperforming among that group of people. And in my particular neighborhood, those are the only people who have lawn signs up at all. There are no lawn signs except for Kamala Harris among the suburban women in the neighborhood. I don't know that their husbands necessarily agree with that, but they're not tearing down the signs. So I think that's where they are outperforming. But like you said, among particularly black males, the question with those people, they're undoubtedly more in Trump's camp, but will they turn out? They're not high propensity voters in some cases. So that's the question with them, is not that they're relatively more in favor of Trump this time around, but will they actually vote?
I was totally shocked by something, and I don't know where it's going to manifest itself in the numbers and votes, but I was at U of O game a few weeks ago, working outside, like campaign stuff, right? Talking to people as they went in. And we weren't like displaying any Trump anything. It was actually more about the congressional candidate there running to Spain. But these young people were walking by. These are 20-something, and more than a few enthusiastically wanted to tell us that they were supporting Trump. They had no idea who the congressional candidate was, but they wanted to tell us they were supporting Trump. And these were young guys, and they were Hispanics, and they were black. And I was just like, what's going on here? I would have thought they'd almost be afraid to say it because it's not something that people openly share in many places in Oregon where it might be considered a liberal bastion, and they didn't care.
Well, that's the question, is including in terms of the polls. Are people less likely to, or are people more likely to admit that they are Trump supporters this time around? Seems like they are. And if they are, they're probably better represented. Trump's probably better represented in the polling than he has been in the past.
Yeah. I don't know. That'll be interesting to look at the numbers afterwards, because I don't know how much of that younger voter, because younger voters do seem to be a little unhappy with things because they're finding that they can't buy houses. Things are really expensive. They remember 5 years ago and think, I thought it was a lot better. What the heck is going on? And they feel a little screwed over. They may not know who to blame for it yet. They may still have other issues they care about more, but it was all guys that was saying this, just guys.
Yeah,
No one.
but I do think people are more susceptible to, they're more aware of the issues surrounding inflation, the cost of gas, the cost of the cost of credit. There's a tremendous number of people are putting a lot of money on their credit cards these days. And
Yeah.
if you have student debt and you're having to put a lot of money on your credit cards, you got to be thinking about the economy. And there's only one candidate who's talking about the economy. The one thing I wish Trump would do more of would be encouraging people to pay attention to the down ballot candidates and
Yeah.
encouraging them to support Republicans down ballot, because he hasn't spent much time or energy that I've heard encouraging that kind of support. And that's one thing I think he could do, and it would make a difference.
Yes, and I think it would make a difference in particular in like some of these congressional seats here in Oregon, but also when you see some Democrats are actually trying to emphasize after years of like saying he was bad and voting to impeach him and stuff, like Sherrod Brown, the senator in Ohio. He's running ads now talking about how he worked together with President Trump, legislation he voted for that Trump signed, and same with John Tester in Montana. And, you know, like you said, if President Trump were saying in those kind of discouraging the ticket splitting in those states, he'd probably pull out some Senate victories for sure, right?
Yeah, Senate and maybe House as well. I think that's something that he could be doing to help ensure that. I mean, if he gets elected and he's president, he's got a certain degree of power. But if he if the Republicans also have the House and the Senate, then he can make a lot of the changes that he wants to make. And we could even actually I think if we saw that, if we saw the Republicans in charge of both the president, the House and the Senate, I think they would actually begin to take on debt issues. They would begin to take on spending issues and try to pull back some of that money that's been dedicated to the crazy green energy expenditures and some of the other big money expenditures that are not productive for either our economy or necessarily our nation, and
Yeah.
pulling back on regulations as well.
Yeah, that's true. Because if you have both houses of Congress, you can actually just start repealing regulations
Right.
that are terrible. And they've put in there's a lot to fix. There's a lot to fix for sure. Well, here's something that in Oregon, we have the ballot initiatives that tend to occupy time on our both in our attention and in our on our ballot. I think we have 5 major statewide ballot initiatives, if I recall. And those ballot initiatives take time to figure out because they don't have Republican or Democrat associated with them. They have a ballot title that you can read, and sometimes that doesn't really help you decide. But then there's also the voter pamphlet, right? We got this voter pamphlet, and there's a lot of pages that are for candidates, but this is where the candidates stop, is like about halfway through. So there's this much that's candidates, and then there's this much that's our just ballot measures and for and against statements. We've got some that were referred by the legislature, and then there's some that were done by people getting signatures, and at least a couple that remind us very much of Measure 110, which you've talked about extensively, which people didn't do enough, really, right, to oppose. They thought, because had there been an opposition. So now some folks have learned from this, and you give a whole presentation on this about what was known, what could have been done. But now we've got Measure 117, which is the ranked choice voting, which is actually supported by an out-of-state interest that just donated, I think, $7.5 million to that campaign.
As was ballot measure 110. It was Soros money. It was Zuckerberg money. It wasn't supported by money in state. It was all out of state money.
And that's even more extreme with Measure 118, where that literally has bipartisan opposition from people in Oregon, plus businesses. I think businesses are largely the only ones shelling out money to defeat it, because it actually would be existential for some of those businesses, because it's a 3% tax on revenue, on sales, for businesses that may not have a profit margin of even 1 or 2%, like grocery stores, right? And so they're pouring money into this. It's even diverting money from other things, quite possibly, from what I understand. But that one is bankrolled by a handful of people in particular one California billionaire.
That's the one that scares the heck out of me because it, excuse me, it's basically a check. What is it? $1,600 for every man, woman, and child. Who's not going to vote for that? That's one that I think has the real potential to pass, but I think it will be devastating for the state of Oregon, both in terms of the businesses that are here, but also in terms of it would then take money out of the general fund, because that money that would be going to the general fund is going to go out to pay out checks to people in the community. And people don't realize how much money that takes out of the general fund. It's a disaster on many levels.
Yeah, it's like a bipartisan disaster imposed by somebody who wants to experiment on a state that I like to say Oregon must have a kick me sign on its back, because they keep trying, because it's a relatively inexpensive media market compared to some other like really blue states. If you want to pass something statewide in California, you have to have tens, sometimes even $100 million plus to do it. And here you can do it with millions or maybe tens, 10, 20 million. And so they decide, well, let's experiment on these Oregonians. And we saw how that went with Measure 110. It went terrible.
Yeah, we have a history of shooting ourselves in the foot, with these kind of feel-good wannabe measures. I just hope Oregonians see through it. I just hope enough people understand that there is no free lunch, that this will be disastrous for our economy. I hope people see through that.
I wonder, is there any polling that's been public about these measures at any point?
Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah, and that's the interesting thing. Now, I'm sure that anybody who's spending millions on advertising did some internal polling. It's some recent point, because they had to figure out what the message would be and what would actually move voters, right? So, and it does seem like in Measure 118, the 3% corporate sales tax that turns into this, check, that the people who are favoring it are trying to make it sound like corporations got the money, they're gouging us, right? And big profitable corporations, which are actually several of the corporations don't even come close to that definition. If you like to have groceries, then you like to go buy them at a place that has 1% to 2% profit margin, and that's it.
Yeah, Oregon Business Alliance? They're doing a phenomenal job trying to get the message out to oppose this measure. But I don't know if they've done a really great job of explaining how not only is it a 3% tax on sales at the wholesale level, it's a 3% tax on manufacturing sales, wholesale, retail. So it adds up all the way down the supply chain. And I don't think they've really communicated that very well with the public to understand it's not just 3% overall. It's 3% on this level of sales, and then on that level of sales, and then on the next level of sales.
That's like a VAT or something.
Yeah, it's compounding.
It compounds, and then also these businesses, if they're not going to just eat it, because they'll either leave or go out of business if they can't pass it on. But if they can, then they're going to pass it on to their customers, which is ultimately the consumer, which means that it's at least 3% inflation.
Right, at least, if not 3 plus 3 plus 3, from manufacturing to wholesale to retail, all the way down the chain.
Yeah, it could be really catastrophic in a state that has a cat tax that already was sending people running for the exits, certain businesses. So that one, the people trying to promote it are trying to sell it as a tax cut. So they must have really poll tested that. The ads are saying this is like a tax cut, and you get your tax cut, even though the checks are going to go to people that pay no taxes whatsoever. I saw that some of the messaging on the anti-Measure 118 side pointed out how dead people who could get a check, because if they've been a resident for 200 days of the year, then they automatically get a check. There's nothing to stop them from getting a check. And then, of course, every single person who came here to try out the inexpensive and unpenalized fentanyl that have been here for 200 days, they're all going to get $1,600 checks. Gee, I wonder if they're going to spend that on fentanyl. And so it's really insane. It's almost like we're going to have a measure that would fuel the very problem that has people most upset with a fair amount of money.
Yeah. It's really it's a disaster in the making. Well, I've already voted. I checked to verify that my ballot has been received, and it has. So I'm happy. I hope everybody does get their vote in early and then checks to make sure it's been received.
Well, I wanted to do that, Mike, but I run into a little problem because I was cruising through, and I always have this issue. I don't like to cast a vote for somebody in a competitive race if I don't know anything about them. And sometimes you read their voter pamphlet statement and you still don't know anything about them because they all sound like, sweetness and light, and they got endorsements. And in Portland, sometimes they have all the wrong endorsements. I don't like either one of them. But I got through that. I got through the measures. And then I got to something that is foreshadowing for measure 117, which is that Portland already has ranked choice voting. And this is what ranked choice voting in the mayor's race looks like. This is what it looks like. You have all these candidates and you have to rank them 1 to 6. I kind of know who I want to be the mayor. All right. But I have to vote for 5 other people. So now I have to go and investigate the entire slate of candidates in order to figure out, because if I don't, and my candidate somehow gets eliminated, then my ballot could become exhausted, which means that I won't count at all
Right. Yeah.
for the subsequent rounds.
Yeah. People who don't know the down ballot people, they might know 2 or 3 people that something about them that might allow them to support them. But if they don't vote the entire group, then their votes could be eliminated after 3 rounds. They have no say. It's I think if Oregonians are smart, at least the ones in the metro area, will look to see how Portland does with this grand experiment with ranked choice voting. See how Portland does before you make it statewide. I would encourage people to just vote no on that one. Watch what happens in Portland. See how that works out before even considering doing a statewide measure.
And the other thing in Portland that makes it even worse is that they have multi-member districts for the new 4 district, 3 people per district that could be elected. So you could have 3 people that could win, and it's ranked choice voting in each district. And it's entirely mathematically possible that even if the one candidate gets more than 50%, one of the 2 other candidates could get less than 20% and still win.
Yeah.
And so you can end up in Portland, that could be an Antifa candidate, somebody that says they represent Antifa. And you could have a city council that's half Antifa simply because of that crazy system. And they've been sending these explanations to us. They send these explanations. Anything that requires that many explanations to figure out how to vote is probably not making it easier for people to vote. And it's probably slowing down turnout. My feeling must be, because you don't even know which you can't vote 6 times for the same person.
Yeah, and there's also some other issues about part of Portland is in Clackamas County, part of Portland is in Washington County. So Washington County has to complete their process before they can turn their ballots into Portland. Clackamas County has to complete their whole process before they can turn their votes into Portland. So this might not be decided until who knows when.
Because it can only be counted by machines. That's the other thing about the ranked choice voting is you really can't hand count it because it has to go through this complex mathematical thing because there's no primary, right? You didn't narrow it down to 2 or 3 candidates and then you just vote for one. It's this thing where you need a math degree to figure out what the effect of your vote is. So anyway, I just thought that was. So how do you poll for a race like that? Has anybody figured that one out?
Yeah, it's very difficult. I've talked to economists who say it's so complicated that even they struggle to determine what they can expect from it. And I've seen examples where people are voting for what kind of dessert they want to have, and the bottom of the list might be broccoli, and yet somehow broccoli manages to rise to the top over the course of the voting. It's crazy. And let Portland do their silly experiment, and then think about it again later in terms of the statewide political policy.
And I live in Portland, but so I kind of wish it weren't the experiment, but I think it's far better that it'd be the experiment than the entire state, right?
Yeah, which is probably why it's on the ballot statewide, because they don't want to wait and let you see how it works in Portland. They want to try to get it pushed through first and without any testing.
So before we wrap up here, I did want to ask you, we're a week out, right? So we're just close enough that we can make wild ass guesses if we wanted as to what's going to happen. Why don't we start at the top with president? I think you kind of voiced what you thought might be happening, at least what you're seeing. What's your guess, and what would be the likely states / electoral breakdown?
I think Trump is going to win it. I think he's going to win it handily. I think he's going to win probably Georgia, probably Virginia, maybe North Carolina. If he wins Pennsylvania, it's going to be over early. And so I'm very hopeful for that. Statewide, I've followed a couple of the congressional races. I'm very hopeful that Lori Chavez de Reimers pulls it out. She's an incumbent. They've thrown a lot of negative ads at her campaign. They've done a lot of negative targeting for her. And Janelle Bynum's a pretty attractive candidate, but she's got some skeletons as well. But I'm hopeful that Lori Chavez de Reimers pulls it out. And I'm very hopeful that Monique pulls it out in CD4 as well. Because that's a district that should be Republican, even if the margin is not quite there. It's a timber district. She supported legislation in Congress, she supports legislation that was in Congress to Reforestation Act, to clean up the slash, to do some thinning in the national forests, to reduce the load, the burning load, and reduce the timber fires. Her opponent, Val Hoyle, voted against that bill, unbelievably, because it's a district that has a huge amount of federal forest land that has been subject to wildfires over and over again. And why she would fail to support that wildfire bill in the House of Representatives is a mystery to me.
Yeah.
But and it did pass in the House, and it goes on to the Senate. So I'm hopeful that bill will pass. But I think Monique Despain would be so much better candidate, so much better representative for that district, and I'm hopeful that she pulls that out.
What do you think about the AG race here in Oregon?
I've heard that Will Lathrop is in single digits down from the Democrat, but it's always tough in Oregon because there are more Democrats than Republicans. And if the turnout is high for both groups, that doesn't bode well for Republicans. But he is a great candidate, and compared to his opponent, he's a fantastically superior candidate in my view in terms of his experience, his worldview. Basically, his opponent, the Democrat for AG, is basically an ambulance chaser from Corvallis with very little experience. He was a small law firm. He has very little experience on the level of attorney general. So I'm very hopeful that Will Lathrop is able to pull that one out.
Well, let's face it, Multnomah and Portland feel differently about things than they did 2 and 4 years ago, with regard to public safety. And that position has a lot to do with that, right? So, because we saw Mike Schmidt and the Schmidt Show lose in May.
Yeah.
And so maybe something similar could happen here. That would be something, is that because Democrats have to do well in Multnomah County to really be sure of winning statewide.
Well, they don't even have to do well, but I mean, Republicans don't even have to do well. They just have to get like about a third of the vote in Multnomah County to have a chance statewide. It's kind of sad that the heavily populated counties have such undue influence on the statewide races.
Yeah, such disproportionate. What about the U.S. Senate and we talked about the House? That one is like a toss-up. You think we'll win the Senate?
The Senate is another one of those really tough ones for Oregon. Republicans are outnumbered. If the turnout is equally high, if both parties are highly motivated to vote, it's going to be tough to win a statewide race in Oregon. I don't have any information on that one. I just know historically it's been really tough for Republicans to win statewide.
Yep. Well, and then there's the U.S. Senate. Nationally, like I think we might end up winning the U.S. Senate narrowly, right? The House, we don't know, but we could be a bellwether here based on these congressional races.
Yeah, I think from what I've heard, the national vote, the U.S. Senate has a real good chance of turning Republican, and so that would be fantastic. Even if we have the presidency and the Senate, that would be monumental for Republicans and for the country.
Yeah, you can get your nominees confirmed. That's huge.
Yeah, or if the Republicans don't win the presidency, you can at least oppose some of the crazy nominees that the Democrats put up.
Measures. I'll just name them off. Measure 116, that is this compensation thing. Sorry, Measure 115 is the impeachment thing. I think that's going to pass.
I have no information on that one. I don't know. I know that I've seen some information that suggests that Republicans have been encouraged to vote no on all those measures. So we'll see. I haven't seen any advertising for that one at all, so I don't know where that stands.
Yeah, I was thinking if the Oregonian editorialized in favor of it, that there's probably a chance. If you got some Republicans also voting for it, then there's this independent commission. We don't know anything about that. That's Measure 116, right? For the pay raises, I don't know. I think most people don't like pay raises, so they might vote no. Is it true measures? Probably you vote no if you don't know anything because you're like, I don't know. That doesn't sound like a good idea.
Yeah, that's generally been the case in Oregon historically, especially on the constitutional measures. Whenever there's a constitutional measure on the ballot, if it's not wildly popular, it tends to be not supported statewide. Yeah. And I hope that's the case with most of these ballot measures.
So Measure 117, ranked choice voting, I'm guessing a no. What do you think?
Again, I haven't seen any polling on it, but I'm hopeful that Oregonians will wait and see on that one, see how it wins or fails in Portland, and make a decision later about that.
Measure 118, is that a toss-up, or do you think that leans no?
I hear from people who are very smart people who think that why wouldn't you vote for that if you've got a family of four? And as they say, when 51% of the public realizes they can write themselves a check, democracy is in trouble. And that could be the case with that measure. People think that, yeah, why not? If I don't pay any taxes and they're offering me $1,600 per family member, why wouldn't I vote for that?
Yeah, the old two wolves and a lamb deciding what's for dinner type of situation, right?
Right.
Voting for that. Measure 119, I don't even know. That's the cannabis one, but it's impossible to predict, actually. Well, I think that covers everything. Is there anything I forgot that you thought we should know before we wrap up here?
Well, the thing that's frustrating about the election is that with all the challenges and all the mail-in ballots, it may be a long time before we find out exactly how things turn out. And that's kind of the frustrating thing. I mean, years ago, you used to know election night. It used to not be very long at all before you'd know how things ended up. But I just hope they can come to get information out and make decisions sooner rather than later. I think that'll be better for the country as a whole.
Yep. Yeah, it would be. And I am a little concerned what happens based on what we both think is going to happen in the presidential election. I don't know if I'm going to be strolling around the streets of downtown Portland much in the days after the election results announced, just based on what happened 4 years ago. But who knows? Maybe things have calmed down, but I'm not gonna rely upon it. Well, Mike, thanks again for joining here tonight, and this is very informative. People love it. I've actually gotten messages from people that I didn't even realize were watching our show. There's a guy who works for a newspaper that he goes, "Did you know I watch Captive Audience?" And I'm like, "No." And he says, "I just caught up on it." And he's like, "They're great because they learn a lot, but it is not like just little sound bites, it's informative." So, and you're one of the great guests that we ever have on. So really,
well, thank you, Kevin. It's been a pleasure.
Well, and we will probably talk again sometime after the election to analyze what happened, because that's probably going to be just as interesting to look back in hindsight and see what we find out. But thank you, everyone, for joining us here tonight. Remember, turn out and turn this country around. You can make a difference. And don't let any of your friends and neighbors sit on their ballot and forget about it. November 5th, 8 p.m. Just get it done. And share the show with everyone you can. Yes, Mike?
Some of them can sit on their ballots.
Some of them, yeah. Well, you know who to talk to and who not. Let other people figure it out themselves. Exactly. But we are actually thrilled that we could bring this show here to you tonight. Share it with everyone you can. They need to know. And 1 week from today, one week and 58 minutes from today, we will actually know quite a bit in Oregon and probably nationally as well. So thanks, everyone, and have a great night.